Hello and welcome friends to this third and concluding lecture on power. Today we will be focusing on this connection between power and knowledge, where we will be using Foucauldian conception of power, and we will see how his conception of power is a kind of radical departure from the usual commonsensical and in ordinary sense of the term when we use power as domination of one over the other. And in that conception of power, we will also see how for Foucault, power is not merely a kind of negative or a kind of suppressive thing, but it also enables, it is also a productive thing for the individual and society. So, this conception we will study and discuss through Foucauldian conception of power. Then we will discuss some other conception of power like feminist conception, Marxist conception, and also pluralist notion of power. Then we will conclude this lectures on power. So, to understand this idea of this radical conception of power, it is necessary to understand this relationship between power and knowledge. Now, this relationship is very unique, and many scholars have argued, and some of you may also be familiar with this idea that knowledge is power. So, if you are knowledgeable about something, that knowledge empower you or gives you power to do something about that knowledge. So, knowledge here is understood as a kind of enabling thing for an individual about doing something or to use that knowledge for certain purposes, for society, for self or for humanity and so on. So, knowledge is seen as power. So, Francis Bacon, the knowledge is power is something which is very crucial to understand. So, this relationship between knowledge and power we conventionally or in ordinary sense understand knowledge as enabling power. It gives power to the person who holds knowledge about something. Now, in Foucault we will see the kind of departure from this relationship between knowledge and power, where how certain forms of knowledge is regarded as knowledge in the first place is the exercise of power. So, for example, say in modern times the healing exercise. So, we have many methods of healing like Ayurvedic, Unani, allopathic and so on. Now, why allopathic is regarded as the solution for the medical problems in modern times? Precisely because in the modern times the power structure and its hierarchy creates a condition where medical knowledge, especially the allopathic, is regarded as the most authoritative, most acceptable forms of healing, and therefore, the other modes of healing is regarded in that hierarchy not really effective or not as effective a knowledge in modern times. So, but at one point of time these other modes of healing were also regarded as effective modes of healing. So, in India in many parts there is still a struggle to assert those modes of healing. So, the point I am trying to make here is that how knowledge is regarded as knowledge is itself the creation of power structure, and that is what Foucault contributes to this relationship between knowledge and power. So, in this relationship, this radical view about this relationship is put forward by Michel Foucault, and he emphasized upon a different aspect of power as productive. So, usually we see power as a kind of repressive, power suppress something, but in Foucauldian understanding we will find he see power not merely as a negative phenomena or a kind of suppressive thing, but it also has some productive elements to it. So, the ordinary understanding of power as coercion, repression or subjugation, Foucault moves beyond that. The term power is productive explains the subtle nature of power. So, the way power functions or operates is not in terms of actual domination or subordination. Power in Foucauldian sense is invisible, but it is always there, it flows through the system. when domination, subordination or contestation or resistance to the exercise of power happens, that shows the effect of power. So, there is nothing without the exercise of power in that sense. So, the term power is productive explains those subtle or the nuance or the invisible pervasiveness of power throughout the system, where domination, subordination and resistance to such domination and subordination occurs. So, knowledge of individuals or subjects is integrally related or linked to the power or effects of power. So, in one of our topics on governmentality, when we will discuss state, we will come again to this point of how state use knowledge or the knowledge of the subjects or the citizens as a tool for governmentality. Is here the knowledge is also used as a tool for the exercise of power. So, knowing the subject to make one's populations visible or the administration aware of the population and its characteristics helps the state to exercise its power more effectively. So, knowledge in that sense is helpful for the exercise of power. So, it generates an integral relationship between power and knowledge, where the relationship between power is not really one supporting the other, but it is a kind of interdependent, where how knowledge is regarded as a knowledge is itself the outcome of the structure of power, but knowledge as a tool also enables the agent or the institution or the state to exercise its power more effectively in the society. It defines how both knowledge and power works simultaneously and not independently. So, the exercise of knowledge and power is a kind of simultaneously and not separately. So, in Foucauldian understanding, this relationship is not of one enabling the other, but how it simultaneously create the effects of power, where power and its exercise becomes more effectively in terms of controlling, in terms of governing the population, society or individual. Now, the Foucauldian understanding of knowledge power relations point out to new ways of observing human beings in a society. So, through this interconnection between knowledge and power, it enables the state and its institution to see the individual in the society in a new way. So, for him, power is not always then repressive or brute or punishes people, but exercise of power is more about techniques or use of techniques like surveillance or gaze to gather knowledge about the subject people and to make effect of power that is realized over the docile subject bodies. So, the exercise of power is not just a kind of repressive brute exercise, but it uses the techniques such as surveillance. So, in prison, if you know the way the inmates are controlled or governed or managed, is something the exercise of this constant supervision or surveillance over them. Similarly, any state while governing or controlling the population uses certain techniques of power, and that techniques of power is not just about merely brute or suppressive exercise of power, but it is something where the role of knowledge, techniques or the modes of such techniques like surveillance and gaze enables the state to gather knowledge about the subject, and then that knowledge enables that institution to govern and control them in a more effective manner. So, here again the relationship between power, knowledge is reflected through the use of techniques like surveillance to gain knowledge or to know about how people works or how they behave and how the self reacts under effects of disciplinary power. So, the power of a state is more kind of disciplining the body without directly physically in the brute manner forcing or repressing someone to do something. So, in modern times, and more on this we will discuss when we will discuss governmentality, when governmental power is more effective when government is not physically available. So, it creates a conditions or a structures or which conditions the individual to act, behave and express in a certain ways, and that invisibility of government is a reflection of its most effective use of power through the techniques of governmentality or disciplinary power. So, power not only restrains or constrains, but in most ways power produces something called knowledge, and knowledge is an exercise of power and power is a function of knowledge. So, there is a kind of again interrelationship between these two phenomena which we call knowledge and power. So, it is not as if it functions independently from each other, but it is a kind of interdependent phenomena. Now, Foucault, in order to understand the relationship between power and knowledge, also emphasized on subjugated knowledge. So, how the knowledge or what we term as knowledge is the exercise of power, or to understand this relationship between or interrelationship rather between knowledge and power, he tried to argue it through this idea of subjugated knowledge. Now, he made a distinction between subjugated knowledge or disqualified knowledge and knowledge which is imposed by an order based on scientific significance or having scientific hierarchism of our local knowledge. So, in a society you have different modes of knowledge, different kinds of knowledge. Why in modern society, for example, only the scientific education or the technological education is regarded as superior to the traditional or conventional knowledge. Now, at one point of time those traditional knowledge or conventional knowledge may be useful or relevant, and those are still relevant for many people and communities today. But in this hierarchy of knowledge in modern times, the scientific and technological education is regarded far more superior to the conventional or traditional knowledge. Here the traditional or conventional knowledge or local knowledge is regarded far more inferior or in a kind of subjugated knowledge than say modern scientific and technological knowledge. So, for him subjugated knowledge is understood as a set of disqualified or local or believed to be inadequate or insufficient knowledge which is considered inferior to the knowledge derived from science or under scientific hierarchism. So, these are the forms of subjugated knowledge which is understood as a disqualified, local or believed to be inadequate or insufficient knowledge in comparison to the knowledge that is derived from science or under scientific hierarchism. So, some of the disqualified or subjugated knowledge that Foucault talked about were psychiatric patients, ill persons, of the nurse, of doctors and knowledge about the medicine. So, he talks about a lot of forms of subjugated knowledge, and that reflects the constant power struggle in terms of creating or positioning one form of knowledge as superior, scientific, hence acceptable, and other forms of knowledge as inferior, traditional, conventional or insufficient, inadequate knowledge. So, he argued that the re-emergence of such disqualified or subjugated knowledge makes us realize that historical struggle. So, this point is very crucial to understand how a particular forms of knowledge becomes a authoritative forms of knowledge or superior forms of knowledge. That is about the historical struggles or conflicts of opinion took place between hierarchy of knowledge available on grounds of its having scientific validity or not. So, here the basic argument about the knowledge and power and the hierarchy of knowledge is that nothing which we take as for granted or which we assume as superior, it was not superior or it has not been superior throughout the history. There have been a constant struggle or conflicts of opinion about a particular knowledge or forms of knowledge, whether it is superior or not. this idea of scientificism or rationality and other things which comes much later, but this struggle over what constitute knowledge and what is not, which form of or what method of knowledge or inquiry can be regarded as superior or not. So, in modern times a lot of things you may happen. For example, I give this example that a form of knowledge is most scientific which is based on the experiment, and that experiment legitimizes that knowledge. That means any person in any lab sitting across the globe involved in the same experiment should arrive at the same result. Only that form of knowledge is considered as most scientific or acceptable form of knowledge. However, human beings also have other modes of knowing, for example, intuitions or guts feeling and so on. Now, those modes of knowing through your guts feeling, so which you know, but you cannot experiment, you cannot explain scientifically, should that form of knowledge regarded as inferior in this hierarchy of knowledge? So, those are the questions which leads us to understand the making of any knowledge as superior or inferior is part of the historical struggle where the scientificism, rationality and methods of inquiry becomes merely as a tool for establishing some modes of knowledge as superior and delegitimizing or disqualifying other modes of knowledge. So, the structure of power and knowledge is in constant interrelationship in creating this power structure or hierarchy of knowledge. So, the re-emergence of such kinds of local or disqualified or subjugated knowledge also provides perhaps a scope to critique knowledge or to argue or find out the difference existed or existing between different kinds of knowledge. So, it happens in the contemporary times also. So, when the authority of allopathy as a modes of healing is widely acceptable, however, there are constant challenge or criticism to these modes of healing by the practitioner of say Unani or homeopathy or Ayurvedic medicine and so on. So, thus in Foucauldian perspective we find power is understood as productive, it produces newer identities and subjectivity. So, we may assume, I will discuss this point again when I will discuss the next sentence, that is in his definition of power, it is more like a capillary flowing throughout the system like blood in the capillaries of our bodies. So, this is the most radical comprehensive understanding of power, which believes power is not just domination, it is not just subordination, it is not the physical or the brute force of one over the other, but it is seen as the productive, and how productive I will discuss. But the circulation of power in the system is like capillary in the veins, the blood which flows through our capillary throughout our bodies. Similarly, power circulates throughout the system. When we see the instances of say domination or subordination or resistances to such dominations and subordination, those are the effect or the particular instances of power, but power is always already flowing throughout the system. So, it flows through this between doctor and the patient, teacher and the pupil, the superior officials or the subordinate officials. So, those circulation of power is already always present. When a superior or a teacher or a medical practitioner uses that power, that is the particular instance or effect of power, not really the power which is. So, the both here, the teacher or the pupil, subordinate or the superior, doctor and the patient are the subject of power. The power over whom it is exercised and the one who is exercising the power, both are here the subject of this circulation of power throughout the system. Now, in this definition of power, you may find this definition similar to say Talcott Parsons' idea of power as money functions in the economy, or for example Hannah Arendt idea of power too, it is a kind of positive power. However, in Foucault we have very radical and most comprehensive account of power so far, where the exercise of power in terms of controlling or discipline really its effect. power is already present and flow through the system which produces newer identities and subjectivities through the techniques of governmentality. Now, there may be a kind of misconception when you get to know that power is like all pervasive phenomena, then what is the scope of any alternative or newer identities or subjectivities that can be produced. This is precisely the point which Foucault is trying to argue, that power is not just about suppression, but it also has enabling capacity. So, human subjectivities, when is conditioned by the structure of power that is in operation, it also gives him or her the opportunity to resist those power, to resist such domination, and that resistance is again coming from the same structure of power, but enables or creates the possibilities of creation of newer identities or newer subjectivities. So, it is not like that power, when understood as all pervasive, closes any possibilities or restrain or limits any alternative imagination of identities or subjectivity. In fact, power is like enabling thing where individual can create newer identities and newer subjectivities and not just become merely the subject or the victim of power. So, now that is the conception of power by Foucault, which we have seen through this dichotomy between knowledge and power. Next is the feminist conception of power, where the focus is the basic idea that how the structure of society or family or the state, which claims to be neutral, makes this suppression or discrimination of women almost invisible in its discourse. So, the focus of feminist writings or feminist scholarship is how power relationship operates in the society, which makes half of the population vulnerable or discriminate them against the other half of the population. So, how this subjugation of women or suppression of women is ensured through these particular modes of power, which radical feminists argue as the patriarchy. So, these structure of power which we will discuss. So, feminist questions first the women's systemic, structural and the unequal access to power. So, feminists believe that the system of patriarchy, and which we will discuss what is this patriarchy, subjugates or dominates and deprived women of resources and equality. So, it started from right from the family and not necessarily in the society or in the state. So, what happens to women in the society and state is the extension of domination and discrimination that women faces in the family. So, the real power struggle or real justice or quest for justice start with the family, where men and women should be treated equally. They should be given equal opportunities right from the family to the society to the state, and therefore, they do not just talk about discrimination in the society or state, but also in the family. And the patriarchy therefore is that structure of power which subjugates, which justify the subjugation and discrimination of women and put them in the inferior condition and so on. So, patriarchy as a system of domination operates at different levels in society, economy, political and cultural and so on, and at the same time it overlaps with other system of power also. For example, the idea of race, class, caste, which also divides the population on the issue of race or class or caste. Now, sometimes the structure of patriarchy overlaps with these structure of power that is based on class, race or caste. For instance, a Dalit or a lower caste woman is affected differently under system of patriarchy in India than a white upper caste woman. So, their oppression or subjugation is not equal. So, that shows the intersectionality in terms of how power structure often come together to treat a particular subject in a different way depending upon his or her social historical status. But oppression or subjugation of women exists in different setups across the globe. Now, in the context of India, I have given the example. Similarly, between black and white women, although they both are women, face different kind of subjugation or discrimination. So, we have different kind of feminists. So, liberal feminist particularly highlights the shortcomings of concepts of liberty, equality, rights and justice that fails to pay attention to the women or gender issue prevalent in society. So, they argue for equality such as that power should be equally distributed among men and women, so that women too enjoy equal power like men in society and can live with dignity, respect and identity of her own and so on. So, these are the arguments of liberal feminists. Thus, they focus on say equal pay for equal work, equal rights, equal freedom and justice like their male counterparts to address gender based discriminations and inequality in society. So, the liberal feminist will argue about equality, freedom and justice for women like their male counterparts to address the gender discrimination in the society. So, the Marxist explanation of politics is based on this idea of class. There they are almost blind to the other kind of discrimination based on gender or caste. So, Marxist feminists will argue about the gender blindness of the class analysis, and in the analysis of gender just society, radical feminists further questions the very basic division of society on gender basis. So, this idea, many of you may be familiar with this difference between sex and gender. Now, this discrimination or difference that is based on sex is biological, right, and the gender is something which is socially and culturally constructed. So, what a particular gender and what role a particular gender should perform, it is not biological, it is socially and culturally constructed. Now, the radical feminist will go one step ahead than the Marxist or the liberal feminist to argue about this basic division of society on gender basis, and they emphasize on the role of patriarchy, which is the root of all discrimination against women in the society, state and in the family. So, they emphasize on patriarchy as the major reasons for subjugated positions of women in the society. So, for feminists, gender is the prime category of social and political analysis. So, they look at the gender, and through gender lens they study the power structure in the society, in the family and in the state. However, there are significant differences between the feminists. So, as I have discussed with you, the differences between liberal feminist or Marxist feminist or radical feminist is significant, and within that there is also other kinds of feminists, say Dalit feminist, black feminist and so on and so forth. So, for instance, a liberal feminist will differ from Marxist and radical feminist will differ from both or vice versa. So, there are rich differences and debates within feminism. However, the common agenda that unites them is making a society more just by ensuring equal opportunities for the women. Now, in feminist contribution to social science or philosophy of knowledge and science is that it opens up new kind of debates about thinking about a just society or a more equal society. So, the point is, for a very long time there was a kind of assumption that state really do not discriminate between men and women, because it is a neutral agent, or so is the society. But here feminist scholarship questions such kind of assumptions and establishes how the gender discriminations or gender based discriminations are made invisible by this assumption of state neutrality or neutrality of the society and so on, which makes the discrimination or injustices that is meted out to women invisible, and the relationship therefore between men and women is not that of equality, but is hierarchical, one exercising his power over the other. Now, another point that we need to focus is that according to the feminist, how a woman is treated by a man is not result of the bad behavior or the bad manners of that particular individual, but it is systemic, it is structural. That means women faces discrimination or subjugation or oppression in different forms, in different situations, historically across the society. Their degree may vary, as I said about the Dalit women or the upper caste women or the white women or the black women and so on, but nonetheless they all faces such discrimination, and that unites them on this question of gender, and they see power oppression through the gender lens. Now the next is the Marxist conception of power, which talks about the idea of exploitation. So Marxist conception of power basically emphasizes upon the exploitative nature of power, where it enables one section of the society to extract surplus from the other section of society, and that gives a kind of tool in the hands of a powerful to exploit those who are vulnerable or those who are in the condition of marginality or vulnerability. So in the Marxist conception of power, it is seen as a kind of exploitative, and it is seen as coercive tool to exploit the laborers or the weaker section in the society particularly. So Marxist theory of power pointed out specifically to a particular type of capitalist mode of production controlled by an economically dominant class. So those who exercise domination economically, they also get to exercise domination politically, socially, culturally and so on. So in Marxist analysis, a state in a capitalist society is constitutive of two classes, basically the bourgeoisie, which owns the modes of production, and the proletariat, whose life and very survival is dependent on that modes without owning that modes of production. So their relationships are determined by their relationship to the means of production. So if a person owns that means of production, that is the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, and the one who is subjected to or whose very survival is dependent on that means of production without owning them is the proletariat, and they are in the large number and they are always in the minority. So we are not going into the details, but the very relationship between the two is determined by their relationship to the means of production. So if that is a society, that is a capitalist society, the nature of a state in such a society is that it work on behest of or on behalf of the dominant capitalist classes, and it is often portrayed as the instrument in the hands of the dominant classes. So a state in a capitalist society works on behalf of bourgeoisie or the capitalist, and it protects the interest of the bourgeoisie, and therefore in the Marxist writing you may say that you may find that many Marxists argued about the withering away of the state. So there is no need of a state, because state is the instrument of class exploitation. So it argues that the legal and the political equality and freedom, in the absence of real social and economic freedom to everyone, is hollow and makes very little sense to a large number of population. Hence it argues for social and economic freedom and equality. So in the Marxist conception, the idea of power is basically about exploitative in nature, which ensures the domination of one class over the other, where state also functions like an instrument in the hands of dominant classes. So in the Marxist analysis, it is said that state is there to manage the common affair of all bourgeoisie and facilitates the exploitation of the proletariat or those who do not own the property or means of production. Their exploitation is facilitated by the state on behalf of or for the benefit of bourgeoisie. So that is about the capitalist mode of economy and how power operates there according to the Marxist conception of power. Now a pluralist conception of power emphasizes on the point that power is exercised by different political groups. So in the pluralist conception of power, there is no single small group of people in a society which exercise power. It is largely exercised by different groups, different individuals and so on. So various political groups participate in the decision making process or influence important policies of the state. So, power is not something which is in the hands of single or the small group of people, but there are different groups, different actors, different institutions which exercises the power. So, they all participate in the decision making processes or influence the important policies of the state. So, power really do not resides in one person or a group of person or a very few institution. It is like more plural in terms of its exercise or in terms of those who yields power or holds power. So, thus it questions the view that any one person or group uphold or exercise political or economic power in society. Unlike the sociological account of power which emphasize on the centralization of power, the pluralists argue about decentralization of power in decision making process. So, the best example is a vibrant democracy. So, power as it operates leads to centralization, but the democracy as a system of rule or governance focuses not on one person, one party, one group and so on, but it gives scope for other groups, other parties and other individuals. So, this leads to a more decentralization of power away from the sociological understanding or emphasis of power which talks about the centralization of power in the society in the hands of single or small groups. So, in contrast to pluralist understanding of power, C. Wright Mills in his work The Power Elites rejects the view that USA enjoys separation of power or it enjoys decentralization of power. So, he argues basically that it is in the hands of elite where power resides, and in turn elites enjoy the power, but large section of the society is always the subject to that power which is exercised by the elites, and power rotates among the elites and not really among the masses. So, there are other criticisms to pluralist conception of power. It is argued that it focuses only on the behavioralist approach, how power actually functions, and not really the wider dimensions of the inherent pervasiveness of power, even when many others are involved who actually controls the decision making. So, P. Bachrach and M. Barge questions the pluralists about the organized political agenda where some of the important socio-political issues gets unobservable or invisible, such as race and minority interest issues. So, in this approach the forms of discriminations or subjugations may never be made visible or observable, because they do not see the hidden structure of power which puts a particular community or a group of people in the condition of subordination. So, they also criticize the pluralists for not directly focusing on the power relationship as existing in a society which proliferates in terms of domination and subjugation of various classes in the society. So, in the pluralist approach they may see the visible participation or a exercise of power, but power by its very nature also have some hidden or some invisible characteristics where it puts some individual or some groups precisely because of certain decisions, certain policies and so on in the condition of subordination, and pluralists fail to understand those conditions of dominations and subjugations of various classes in the society. Now, in these three lectures we have seen different conceptualization of power, and we have studied its relationship between authority and legitimacy. Now, power remains one of the central but most complex and essentially contested concept in political theory, and this we have discussed through different scholars and different perspectives and their approach to power. So, it reflects the contested nature of such conceptualization. However, it is central in the organization of modern state and politics. So, you cannot think about and argue about politics in any society or state without referring to power. So, the power remains the central category in any discourse on modern society or modern polity. However, it is often not that visible or expressed. So, through many examples we have seen that the way power is understood in the commonsensical ordinary sense as suppression or the brute force or the domination is not really the adequate understanding of way power operates. So, right from the Stephen Luke's 3 stages of power or 3-dimensional view of power to Talcott Parsons to Gramsci and then Foucault, we have seen how power is most effective where its operation is made almost invisible. So, the comprehensive or the most adequate understanding is to understand the functioning or the operation of power where there is no direct or visible agent involving in its exercise, where everybody feels that everything is fine and they are doing for some great thing, and yet they are subject to a particular ideology or a particular power structure. So, power in that sense is most effective when its use or its exercise is made invisible. So, we have to finally remember both its negative as well as the positive dimension of power. So, power when it operates or it creates a structure of domination, subordination, it does not only have the negative role, but it also has the positive dimensions where it enables one to do something, to become something and provide them the opportunities and scope to produce newer subjectivities and newer identities. For example, I am giving you these hypothetical examples. For a very long time Indians were ruled by the British rule, and generation after generation they believe that British rule will be there and that is their fate, then they should abide by or subject themselves to the British rule. But gradually they, in the same power structure, they realized, they mobilized and formed and created a newer subjectivities which give them the confidence to fight against the British. Now, how you understand that situation if it is just power is just about domination and subordination, but power also has the productive or the positive dimension where it enables the subject of its power to create newer subjectivities and newer identities, which we must also take into account when we discuss and debate about the power. It is not merely about domination and suppression. Now, to conclude this lecture, you can refer to some of these writings like Norman Barry, An Introduction to Modern Political Theory, and then Rajiv Bhargava and Ashok Acharya, there is a chapter by Menon on political theory and introduction on power. Michel Foucault you can read from Power and Knowledge, that is the selected interviews and other writings. So, this is very original text on Foucauldian conception of power and the relationship between power and knowledge. And from Rod Deborah you can study feminism and the state. So, these are some of the readings for this lecture today, and with that we conclude this lecture on power. In the next lecture we will take up new topic, that is on state and sovereignty. So, please write to us what you feel about this lecture, and also write your queries. We will be happy to respond. Thank you for listening. Thank you all.